In 1945, the most powerful empires on earth stood victorious over fascism. They had won the war. And yet, within 2 decades, these same nations would find themselves financially subordinate to the very country they had once. Considered a junior partner. How does winning a war lead to losing an empire? The answer lies not in military defeat, but in a currency trap so elegant, so invisible, that even the sharpest minds in London and Paris never saw it coming. Let us travel back to the summer of 1944, to a resort town nestled in the mountains of New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. Here, delegates from 44 nations gathered in the Mount Washington Hotel to design the financial architecture of the post-war world. The war was still raging in Europe and the Pacific, but the men in this room were already fighting a different battle. One over the rules that would govern money itself. 2 visions dominated the conference. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist, proposed an international currency called the Bancor, a neutral unit of account that would prevent any single nation from dominating global finance. Across the table sat Harry Dexter White, the sharp-tongued American negotiator with his own agenda. White wanted something far more advantageous for the United States. He wanted the dollar to become the center of the entire system. The Americans won. They could afford to. The United States held 2/3 of the world's monetary gold reserves. Its industrial base was intact, untouched by bombing. Its military controlled the Atlantic and the Pacific. Britain, by contrast, was exhausted. Its treasury was empty. Its empire was crumbling. Keynes understood the implications perfectly. He returned to London and reportedly told his colleagues that they had signed away British financial sovereignty for a generation. He was being optimistic. The Bretton Woods system worked like this. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar. Central banks could theoretically exchange their dollars for American gold, but in practice, they rarely did. The dollar was as good as gold. Better, actually, because dollars could earn interest. This arrangement seemed reasonable in 1944. Europe needed American goods to rebuild. Dollars were scarce. Everyone wanted them. But here is where the trap began to close. To rebuild their economies, European nations needed to import American machinery, food, and fuel. To pay for these imports, they needed dollars. To get dollars, they had 2 choices: sell goods to America, which was difficult because American tariffs were high and European factories were rubble, or borrow from America. They borrowed. Britain alone owed the United States over $4 billion by 1946. A loan that came with strings attached, including the requirement to make the pound freely convertible. When Britain tried to fulfill this obligation in 1947, the result was a catastrophic run on sterling that drained British reserves in 6 weeks. France faced a similar predicament. Charles de Gaulle would later describe the dollar's privilege as exorbitant, allowing Americans to print money and purchase real assets around the world while other nations had to earn their currency through actual production. He was not wrong. The United States could run deficits in ways no other country could. When America spent more than it earned, those dollars flowed overseas. But instead of causing a crisis, those dollars became other nations' reserves. The more America spent, the more dominant the dollar became. Consider the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1951, the United States distributed over $12 billion to Western Europe. This was genuine generosity with strategic purpose. But it also meant that European economic recovery was denominated in American currency and dependent on American goodwill. The recipients were grateful. They had little choice but to be. Yet with each dollar they accepted, the infrastructure of American financial hegemony grew stronger. By the late 1950s, Europe had rebuilt. German factories were humming. French vineyards were exporting. British banks were financing global trade. And yet, the dollar remained supreme. European nations accumulated vast reserves of American currency. They were wealthy in dollars, but trapped by them. If they sold their dollars en masse, they would crash the value of their own reserves. If they demanded gold, as was their technical right under Bretton Woods, they risked destroying the system that underpinned their own prosperity. France under de Gaulle actually tried. In 1965, France began systematically converting its dollar holdings into gold, shipping bullion across the Atlantic to Paris vaults. De Gaulle understood that dollars were claims on American wealth. Gold was wealth itself, but France was too small to force systemic change. Other nations hesitated. They feared American retaliation. They feared chaos. Most importantly, they feared what would replace the dollar if it fell. The turning point came in August 1971. President Richard Nixon, facing inflation at home and a drain on American gold reserves, made a fateful decision. He closed the gold window. From that moment forward, dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold at any price. The promise that had underpinned the entire system was simply revoked. You might expect this to be the moment the dollar collapsed. It was not. Instead, the dollar remained the world's reserve currency, but now without any constraint whatsoever. America could print money without limit. Other nations still needed dollars to buy oil, because by 1974, the United States had negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia to price all petroleum sales in American currency. The petrodollar system replaced the gold standard, and the trap became permanent. The victors of World War II had become creditors of a currency they did not control. They held trillions in American debt instruments. They financed American consumption. When the United States waged wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, other nations effectively paid for them by holding dollars that America printed to cover the costs. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply how the system worked, how it still works today. What does this history reveal about our current moment? The mechanics have not changed. The United States runs persistent trade deficits. Foreign central banks hold over $7 trillion in reserves. American consumers buy goods from China, Japan, and Germany. And those nations lend the money right back by purchasing treasury bonds. The trap remains elegant and effective. Nations that export to America become financially invested in American stability. They cannot exit without destroying their own wealth. China understands this perhaps better than any nation since de Gaulle's France. Beijing has spent years attempting to internationalize the yuan, to create alternative payment systems to accumulate gold. But the infrastructure of dollar dominance, built over 80 years, is not easily dismantled. Every nation that challenges it risks isolation from the global financial system. The dollar is not just currency. It is power made liquid, flowing through every port and every bank, invisible and inescapable. And so we return to our original paradox. Britain won the war and lost its empire. France liberated itself from occupation and walked into a different kind of dependency. Germany and Japan rose from ashes only to become the largest financiers of American debt. Victory in battle meant nothing without control of the currency. The nations that made the rules made the future. This is the lesson that echoes through every financial crisis, every trade negotiation, every central bank decision made today. Military power fades, industrial advantage shifts, but the architecture of money, once established, shapes the world for generations. Those who understand this truth see history not as a sequence of wars and treaties, but as a continuous struggle over the most fundamental question of all: who controls what money is and who gets to create it? The currency trap of 1944 never really closed. We are all still living inside it.